While the United States pretends to be carrying out peacekeeping missions around the world, whenever they tell you this, I want you to laugh right in their face because they're lying to you. That's what the United States does. They tell us they're going on. They're peacekeepers, right? We're a force for good. We're going there to keep the peace. Of course, this is the case with Somalia, right? Where for 16 years, the United States carried out an occupation that helped kill tens of thousands of innocent Somalis. And you'll recall that President Biden reversed Donald Trump's withdrawal of U.S. forces in Somalia a few months ago, right? And this was seen as a victory for people who supported President Trump. But don't get too high on the hog because he still carried out massive amounts of drone strikes, did President Trump, and a lot of innocent people died. So, again, none of these presidents have pulled back technically on military presence around the world. So don't get too high up on that. But President Biden, yes, reversed course. And so President Trump did, in fact, bring ground forces home. So we can give him credit for that. Then President Biden reversed it, okay, and sent them right back again. So, yes, sent Americans back to die in Somalia, to kill Somalis. That's exactly what they're doing. Well, Biden got his wish because yesterday the United States started ramping up again these attacks with the killing of 13 so-called terrorists. Now, I'm doing quote marks here, so-called terrorists, because we'll get to that in a second. But here's the headline. U.S. bombs Somalia, says 13 al-Shabaab fighters killed. This is Dave DeCamp reporting over at antiwar.com. The strike is the second within a week, signaling an escalation in the war, he writes. The U.S. launched an airstrike in Somalia on August 14th, the second bombing within a week, signaling that the Biden administration is escalating the war against al-Shabaab. U.S. Africa Command, which is AFRICOM, announced the airstrike on Wednesday and claimed that it killed 13 al-Shabaab fighters. The command said that the strike was launched against al-Shabaab members that were attacking Somali government forces in a remote village. Right? So we don't have any other confirmation of that anywhere else, just what they tell us, of course, right? AFRICOM said in its initial assessment found that no civilians were injured or killed, right? Well, we know how that goes, right? So their initial assessment that no innocents were killed in the making of this film. Sure, we believe that, right? The reason I say so-called terrorists, though, is because, as TJ Coles writes at the Gray Zone, the context behind the U.S. attacks in Somalia is naked imperialism. Using counterterrorism, the term counterterrorism, as the latest in a long line of excuses to interfere in the politics of strategically significant country in the Horn of Africa. So we just use this cover, this idea of calling it counterterrorism, but what we're doing is we're literally taking control of this country for strategic reasons. Of course, we should point out that these are war crimes, what the United States is doing here. Why are they war crimes? Well, because the United States signed the United Nations Charter. Okay? By the way, on your screen right here, those are U.S. forces. Those are U.S. forces in Somalia. Not those, but the ones before that. Of course, we should, and I mentioned these war crimes. The United States signed the UN Charter and must get authorization from the United Nations and their Security Council before any military action anywhere. But we don't. The United Nations didn't sign off on any of this, of course. So, technically a war crime. Of course, the entire reason we're in Somalia is not to help the Somali people. No, it's to maintain our ability to respond militarily to anything right in the Horn of Africa. That's it. So we will use your country as a proxy base to do whatever we want. This is how we do it. And I should put this out. This is exactly how it unfolds. This is the Somali strategic importance screen I want to put up here on the screen. This is from the Gray Zone. A George W. Bush era report by the U.S. Army War College notes that even before the Suez Canal came into being, the Red Sea had been of importance as an international waterway. It served as a bridge between the richest areas of Europe and the Far East. The report emphasizes that the geopolitical position of the Red Sea is of special importance. AFRICOM was founded with a grand imperial ambition to make the 4 of the 5 countries on Africa's Red Sea coast, Djibouti, Eritrea, Somalia, and Sudan, comply with U.S. elite interests. and to keep the Sea, Gulf of Aden, and the Suez Canal open for business and strategic deployment. It's laid right out there for us, right? Mm-hmm. So how do we just invade these countries without a reason? Well, here's how we do it. We create terrorists in those countries, and then we invade them. Or we call them terrorists. They're not actually terrorists. We call them that, and then we invade on, and we use the umbrella of counterterrorism to invade these countries. In fact, the idea of terrorists is a fabrication that the United States and the UK use as a smokescreen. Now, I want to point you to this fascinating research paper from Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, which looks at how the West basically invents the idea of terrorists wherever it wants to invade. I want to read this part of this for you here. Look at the name of the paper from Johns Hopkins. It's called The Invention of Terrorism in Somalia: Paradigms and Policy in U.S. Foreign Relations. The article first traces events in Somalia since 9/11, the rise of the Islamic courts, the Ethiopian occupation, the recalibration of the interim government, and the al-Shabaab insurgency. A second layer of analysis brings into focus three fluctuations in the external perception of the Somali crisis. There's a post-World Cold War narrative of state building. So that's what we say, we're going to help build the state. And then it says we're going to call it the war on terror. And then a reloaded vision of state building as counterterrorism. And so such models, they say, informs U.S. policy, yet their roots lie in an Anglo-Saxon intellectual edifice detached from the Somali context.
Okay, I mean, that's clever.
Literally, like, we create the term so that we can justify the invasion, but it's not rooted in the actual context of what's happening in Somalia. We invent it, and we do it in Syria. We do it all over the place.
Right.
I mean, to read through this paper is fascinating. We're not going to go through all of it, but I just wanted to give you the headline, what the thesis of the paper is anyway. We've been actively involved in destabilizing Somalia since their independence. The CIA placed a dictator in power in 1969 and then ruled until 1991. Did you know that after the 9/11 attacks, George W. Bush in 2001 used an excuse to sanction Somali banks? 9/11? We're going to sanction Somali banks? Basically taking their money. And then eventually they cleared the banks of any wrongdoing, but we just went in and sanctioned their banks. Since then, Somalia has been a testing ground for like the idea of like a cashless society. Like, here's what we're going to hear. We'll use Somalia as a way to make sure you don't have any cash. Do it all digitally. We'll control everything. But of course, in Somalia, as TJ Coles writes, we are bombing the very terrorists that we created. In Somalia, the U.S. is bombing the very terrorists it created, he writes. Just like we do in Syria, where we pretend that we're protecting the people of Syria by arming al-Qaeda so that they can carry out attacks against the Assad government. That's what we do. And then while we steal their oil like we did last week in Syria, here's a convoy, and this is exactly what we do. We steal their resources and we use it for strategic interest. Look at your screen. This is hidden camera footage of U.S. tankers miles long stealing Syrian oil. And by the way, this Syrian oil, we have 2,000 U.S. forces, 2,000 American forces that were supposed to be protecting the Syrian oil for the Syrian people. That's what the U.S. position is on this, which was laughable. We had journalist Kevork Almasian on the show who said it's just laughable. They're not there to protect the oil for the Syrian people. They're there to steal it. And so here they are, caught on camera, trucking out tanker after tanker after tanker filled with Syrian oil so that we can ship it to America or sell it at other places. That's what we do.
Well, we have a gas crisis. It's Putin's.
Oh, it's Putin's price hike, so we need to steal their oil.
We have to go get it from somewhere else.
So I think very, very important to understand Somalia and to understand the reason that we're there is not to help the Somali people or anything. It's not even to go after terrorists. We created these guys through extremism. It was actually fairly peaceful in the early 2000s. We created this with the help of the British. And it's all to have control of the Horn of Africa, to make sure that in case something happens to the Suez Canal, we've got control of that whole area and all of our shipping lanes are open. And so we have strategic military interests there. That's it. That's it. That's it. There's no other reason.
That makes sense why African nations then are having these conferences saying the continent of Africa needs to become self-sufficient on our own fossil fuels.
Yes.
And then the West comes in and says, don't use fossil fuels. It's bad for the earth. We use fossil fuels. You don't.
Right.
We take yours. But don't you care about the environment? Yeah. African nations, you can't be self-sufficient on fossil fuels.
Just use solar panels and windmills.
Right.
Yeah.
You don't need that. We need your fossil fuels. And, that's bad for the earth, we say.
But let's wake up, people. Let's wake up. When they're labeled terrorists, we know that this is the strategy. Label them terrorists, and then we can justify invading their country, and then we foment more of it, and we arm them, and then we attack them. This is what we do. This is what we've done in Syria. It's what we're currently doing in Syria. It's what we do in Ethiopia. It's what we're doing in Somalia. Wake up, wake up, wake up.